Okay, well, a very, very warm welcome to House of Hormones, where puberty and perimenopause clash, and we are going to try and find a route back to calm and peace. My name is Amy Woodhouse. I'm the Chief Exec of Parenting across Scotland, and it is my great pleasure to be your host this evening. I am delighted to be joined by two knowledgeable and wise people on our journey of exploration this evening. Katie Walker is Learning Facilitator for the Scottish Centre for Conflict Resolution, and Lindsay Harrison is a nurse practitioner and founder of Workplace Menopause Support. Next slide, please, Caroline. And this event is being delivered in partnership between Parenting Across Scotland, the Scottish Centre for Conflict Resolution, and Workplace Menopause Support. And you can find out a little bit about our organisations on this slide. And together this evening, we are going to explore two phenomena that affect many households simultaneously, but are seldom talked about at the same time, and that is puberty and perimenopause. And it is somewhat surprising that they aren't put together more often because they share a number of features in common, as we're going to find out about later. And when we're talking about households, we understand the wide variety of forms that this can take. So this could include single parent households, it could include same-sex households, could include households with grandparents living in as well, mixed heritage households with different cultural expectations of puberty and perimenopause. So there are lots of different ways in which families can experience these phenomena. And we'll go into that a little bit more, hopefully later on. So with no more delays, I will hand you over to Katie Walker, who is going to talk to us a little bit about what happens in the teenage brain during puberty. So Katie is the learning facilitator at SCCR, where she delivers sessions to parents, carers, professionals and practitioners and young people around conflict resolution and emotional health and well-being. And in this role, she creates and delivers workshops designed around the psychoeducational resources from the SCCR, which delve into brain development, coping skills, relationships, and conflict resolution. And her background is in teaching, where she focused on creating inclusive, supportive environments for young people and applies this experience when developing and delivering workshops. So, Katie, over to you.
Amazing. Thank you, Amy. Yep. Hi. Thank you everyone for joining. It is lovely that we have so many people here this evening, particularly on an evening. So thank you so much. So as Amy said, I'm Katie. I'm here as part of the SCCR. And today we're going to have a little look at the kind of biological foundation of adolescence. So we're going to focus on how hormones actually drive the physical, emotion, and the neurological changes that we see during this key developmental period. So when we're talking or when I'm speaking about adolescence, that teen period, generally I'm referring to anything kind of the World Health Organization refers to this as anywhere between 10 and 19. But as we're going to focus particularly on the brain as well, I would say this goes up to that kind of age of 24, 25. So anywhere between that kind of 10 all the way up to 24, 25, we're experiencing all these changes that we associate with puberty and adolescence. Next slide, please, Caroline. So if you're here as a young person, fantastic. I just want you to think about how this affects you now. If you're here as a parent care professional, I just want you to think back. Hopefully that's not too far back, but think back to when you were a teenager. And we're going to use the little raise hand function. If you can find that on your screen, should be at the bottom. And I just want you to click that button if any of the following apply. So the first one, raise your hands please if, and Caroline, you should click. If when you were a teenager, or if you are a teenager now, you slept in late and you went to bed later. So I can see already Lindsay and Amy have put their hands up. Yes, it's something I really wish I could still do. I absolutely remember being up until a certain time and then I could sleep all day and it was amazing. So I should hopefully, if you can see, if you can raise your hand, it should just pop up and I'll be able to see. Fantastic. Okay, next one, please, Caroline. Same again, if you know that you engaged in risky behavior, choices that you maybe now wouldn't make on reflection. So again, hands up if you can think back. You might have a specific incident in mind. I know there are lots of things now that I probably haven't even ever brought up to my mum because now I know that probably wasn't the best choice. I've kept them quiet, and I think I probably will keep those quiet. And the last one, please, Caroline. If you recall being more likely to have bigger emotional reactions. So if you kind of remember or you look back again now and you think, I don't really know why that brought such an emotional reaction, but I remember really reacting to that. I absolutely remember this one. I remember tears. I remember the door slamming that someone had mentioned. And when I think back, either I can't remember what it was, but I remember the reaction, or it was something really ridiculous. Like I think a lot of them were to do with clothes. Now I think how ridiculous that I was that mad about that. But to me, I remember thinking, wow, my parents are such unreasonable people, and I'm clearly being reasonable. Um, so I saw lots of hands up. I've seen somebody said they can't find the hands up function. Don't worry. I'm just taking this time really because I want you to think back and see what you can remember and see if you can remember any of these things happening. Because really, all of these things are very normal in adolescence, and we probably have all likely experienced them or can remember something. And that's going to be looking at kind of the changes that happen in our brain actually drive quite a lot of these that we see. Next slide, please, Carolyn. Oh, we've jumped two. There we go. Thank you. So as I said, we were going to look at the kind of how the hormones drive it. In particular, during puberty, we obviously think about hormones quite a lot. I think most of us are aware of the physical changes that happen during puberty. So we're not going to focus on those as much. We're going to focus on the way the hormones change or have an impact on our emotional, our neurological parts of our teenage body. So as we said, we're thinking about it beginning some point between the age of 10 and 13. And that's where we see those hormones kick in, producing these changes that we'll talk about. And then we know it kind of goes on until our early 20s, so that 24, 25 mark. But it's a very rough age range between them. This is where we see the surge of these different hormones, so stress hormones, our sex hormones, growth hormones in adolescence, all of these are going to influence the way that a way the adolescent brain functions and develops. So we know we've got all these hormones having this impact. When we think about kind of the sex hormones in particular, we think about the kind of obvious physical changes that we see, but actually there's also the idea of the way they're linked to our production of serotonin, which we know then is linked to our regulating mood and arousal, which will become important when we think about the changes that are happening in the teenage brain. In particular, this then gives us a little bit of a kind of idea of where we know lots of mental health issues often arise during this adolescence and puberty period because of the changes in the hormone. So it's always something to kind of look out for. One to kind of flag in particular is we know that estrogen or the estrogen that's kind of being produced in teenage girls can increase the risk of depression. So there's sometimes links there that are worthwhile kind of having that in mind of we know this period of where all the hormones are coming in and changing can have an impact on our mental health. The one other kind of thing to, or the little kind of caveat to reflect on is that we know adverse childhood experiences, so ACEs, or any stress in a young person's life can also affect this brain development. So any of these ACEs will have an effect on the way the brain development develops, and then actually can have an effect on things like learning behavior and even potentially health. Um, I've just seen someone's popped up a question as well about the impact of that. I will explain a little bit when we talk about the brain changes in general. And then on top of that, the changes then that can happen if we've experienced ACEs or stress. So that's how we're gonna explore each of these in a little bit more detail this evening. Next slide, please, Caroline. So as I said, to understand all that, we then need to have a little look at the brain development. So at the SCCR, we use our Monkey versus Lizard, which is our psychoeducational resource, that explains just how the brain is developed. This is the brain in general. So we refer to our lizard brain as the kind of old part of our brain, which is our limbic system and our brainstem. So as you can see on the slides, they're responsible for emotions. It's like our danger detector. And then the brainstem, which controls our body regulation processes, our eating, our sleeping, temperature. So we call that our lizard brain, almost like our more emotional and danger detector side. And then we have our prefrontal cortex, which is our monkey brain. And this is our kind of the bit that was developed later. And it is the bit that develops later in adolescence as well. And the prefrontal cortex is responsible for all our cognitive function. So anything to do with thinking, problem solving, reasoning, empathy, that all comes from our prefrontal cortex. So we use both of these parts, and they should work together, and they do most of the time. But today we'll explain a little bit about what happens when in adolescence, the difference in development. And as that question had asked, a little bit about how ACEs as well, or stress, can also affect that too. Next slide, please.
Katie, I just noticed in the Q&A there was somebody, if you could just explain what ACEs was again in terms of what it stands for.
Yeah, so ACEs are our adverse childhood experiences. There is quite a long list of them now, and actually, I think some might have been added. So if you have a search, you'll see, but generally that can be things kind of as extreme as abuse. But it also can be things like two-parent households or divorce can actually be counted as an ACE. That is not to say they absolutely have an effect on young people. It's to say the more ACEs a young person has experienced, the more likely percentages are go up of other developmental issues or health issues. It's worth having a little look into if it's something that interests you. I would just search it. But when we talk about ACEs, we're talking about adverse childhood experiences. Thank you, Amy, for that. So then when we're thinking about puberty, there is a lot going on in the teenage brain. So we have all of that happening in our brain anyway, and then we hit puberty and we have this remodeling happening. And I think during puberty, the change that most of us kind of are guilty of forgetting is actually the developmental bit of the brain. You know, we think about all the obvious things that we see, and the bit we kind of forget about is actually so many big changes are going on in a young person's brain. There's so many changes happening. And often that's referred to as remodeling. So during this time, that growth information is happening at a rapid rate. It's the same with babies when they're first born. There's a huge kind of growth rate of growth. It happens again in puberty. So during this time, the neural circuits in our brain are under construction all the way up until our mid-20s. So that's why we were saying up until that mid-20s point, that 24, 25, meaning that different areas of our brain aren't actually fully communicating with one another before this point in time. And the last kind of connections often to be made are that prefrontal cortex. So that is still developing, and that's the one that helps us with our judgment, our problem solving, our reasoning, our empathy. So we know adolescence, that prefrontal cortex, the bit that's helping us with all that, isn't finished developing, which then makes sense when we think about young people often relying more on that lizard brain, and that limbic system is much more active, so much more emotional, and kind of much more likely to react to what seem like perceived threats. So we have these three kind of big changes. So the synaptic pruning, you might have spotted our lovely Inside Out picture underneath. So if you've seen the film Inside Out or Inside Out 2, you might have seen the little workers who go around destroying things. Either I think some of them are blowing them up, some of them are knocking them down. But this is actually to represent synaptic pruning, and it's exactly what happens in the adolescent's brain. And that means they're getting rid of those kind of connections between things and getting rid of the synapses to make pathways much more direct. So often it's things that are helpful and we need to do. So if we're learning a new skill, it can be really helpful that we're getting rid of the ones and the connections we don't need anymore, and we're making more direct paths and connections in that way. So that's what the little guys in Inside Out are doing. Then we have this process called myelination. And essentially, this is just a fancy word where the nerves are insulated with a layer that enhances the efficiency of the transmissions. So this is what affects the nervous system and improves things like motor skills, sensory abilities, and cognitive function. So we've got the pruning going on and then strengthening between the ones that are needed. And then, as we've already briefly touched on, we know that the prefrontal cortex is developed much later. So again, not finished fully developing until about the age of 24, 25. So we're much more likely to rely on our lizard brain up until that point, much more likely to use that limbic system, which we're going to have a look at what that in turn affects. So next slide, please, Caroline. So because we know that prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, this is where we see the limbic system kind of being much more active. And then there's changes happening there too. And along with that, those different hormones being released as well. So we have kind of 6 key points that we see in adolescents' behavior or changes in their brain that affect then this behavior. So the first one is the emotional intensity, which makes sense. So during adolescence, we know the amygdala is much more active than in early childhood and adulthood. So we experience emotions much more intensely. We might even kind of, react to things that don't almost seem like they need a reaction. It might just be, did you have a good day at school? And that little kind of warning goes off in the brain of school is the stimulus and that's a threat, so I'm going to react. And it feels like a threat to them because that part of the brain is what is being activated. So we know that's where, as we said at the beginning, and lots of you kind of put your hands up or agreed, that actually that kind of emotional intensity kicks in, that we once we kind of move past that stage, we realize maybe that isn't as normal. And to react that, but because that thinking part of the brain isn't fully developed, instinctively, that's where young people's brains will go to. That they'll rely on that limbic system. And it means they won't kind of take the time to think, okay, is this a reasonable question? Where's my empathy? Are they just being considerate? Or having that kind of problem solving. And that's why then it's just jumping to, that seems like a threat, so I'm going to react because I'm in that fight or flight or freeze and shutdown state. We then have the identity formation. So our memory and our emotions are very closely linked, both parts of which are in the limbic system. So we know that during adolescence, we begin to use emotion and memory to form that sense of self and identity. So again, where you might notice attachment changes a little bit when children are younger, we know that it's their kind of parent carer or their kind of main caregiver. Then it moves to a role model, so other adults, teachers. And then in adolescence, we start to see them move towards their peer group and their socials. So that's where that attachment and relationship changes, and then it kind of links in with that identity formation too. It's a really important part of growing up, that social shift into adulthood where we are looking for new connections and attachment, completely normal, but very difficult probably for parents and carers to have to experience, going from the attachment being, you to actually the attachment is going to be kind of social groups and peers that they're looking to. And then we've got motivation and evaluation. So again, this link between that kind of prefrontal cortex not being fully developed and the hormones that are released. We know the motivation and kind of reward system is heightened in teenagers. So we know that the level of dopamine in adolescence is much lower. So the baseline is much lower than it is than when we are adults. And what that means then is they have to kind of take higher risks or more risks to get a bigger hit of that dopamine. So this is where we see that risky behavior potentially coming in, that it might feel like we need to do something riskier or we have to take more risks to get that bigger dopamine hit, to get that kind of happy drug going through our body. Obviously, this doesn't mean it's necessarily negative. Healthy risk taking is again important part of teenage life. It's what we should kind of be doing, to a certain degree. We want to take risks. That's how we develop our independence. That's how we work out, what we like or what we dislike. We want to find new experiences, find new hobbies, find new social circles, and we do that by taking risks. Obviously, that then falls into kind of dangerous risk taking. That's where the concern comes in. But we know that that's something that is affected in teenage kind of hormones. And then sleep. When we think about sleep, another hormone that has a huge effect in adolescence. We know melatonin is released much later in the day. So we know it's released to regulate the body's sleep cycle. In adolescence, it's released much later in the day, which then we think about what we asked at the beginning of, did you stay up later? Did you sleep in longer? Likelihood is yes. Again, it might not be everyone, but a strong chance is yes, because of what's actually happening in our bodies. We are likely then to stay up much later because the melatonin is released later, but we still need the same amount of sleep, so we're likely to sleep in later too. And it's so important that teenagers still do get that sleep because that's when all those hormones are released for kind of growth and development. So it's really important that the sleep is still there. It's still important, still amount of time. It just might be a different kind of timing. And I think the go-to that often people refer to teenagers as lazy, they're sleeping all day. Actually, having that in mind of the effect that melatonin has can be really helpful to remind us, actually, it's not lazy. It's not a young person just wanting to sleep all day. It's the way their body is working at this point in their life. And then obviously growth, we know there's changes going on in their body, the obvious ones that we see in puberty. But during adolescence, we know that the brain releases all these different hormones, all these different growth hormones, and they need to be released to work in different areas. Um, and as we've said already, we know during sleep is the time that that happens. So that's where sleep becomes so important. So as you can see, there is a lot going on in teenagers. A lot going on in teenage bodies. It can be really overwhelming for young people. It can be really overwhelming for parents and carers that all these changes are happening. And as Lindsay will speak about, then we have menopause in with that and perimenopause, where often there's similar things going on. Um, so all these changes are happening. In particular, thinking about these changes in the brain can be really useful to remind yourself that these are things that are kind of physically happening and changes that are happening inside your young person that can attribute to some of the challenging behaviour we sometimes see. So, in saying that, Caroline, if you could go to the next slide. Uh, just some ideas of how we can support young people when it comes to things like puberty. Health education is obviously a really important one. Coming to things like this is amazing. And if you've got young people on this evening joining, fantastic, because hopefully you've heard something you maybe didn't know about the changes that are happening in your brain. But teaching teens about puberty and the brain development, it reduces that fear. It reminds us all that it is very normal, that this is what happens to everyone. And then we have things like our resources online on our website that you can have a look at too, that just really kind of remind us that this is an experience that everyone will have. We all go through these hormonal changes. So having those open kind of discussions too. So that comes onto our open communication, being honest and being open about it. Even kind of promoting, and I think Lindsay says something very similar, but having these open conversations of these are the changes that are happening. It's normal. This is what's being really difficult for me. Are you experiencing anything the same? Um, and it works both ways then. If you're having those open communications and open conversations, it's much easier to set boundaries to say, this is something that I'm really struggling with, so I need help with this. In terms of kind of promoting and modeling positive habits, we want to show young people that that's how we help with that. So having like an exercise, coping skills, a balanced diet, enough sleep, as much as we can, we're kind of showing we know there's hormonal fluctuations, we know there's emotional fluctuations, but I'm trying to do what I can to support myself. So, what can you do to support yourself too? Seeking outside help and support, absolutely. We already mentioned that lots of emotional and mental health disorders often begin around this adolescent stage because of the changes in hormones that are happening. So being mindful of that, looking out for kind of third sector organisations, events like this, looking for government services, therapy, reaching out to schools if you think there is something that you're struggling with. And really important to take care of yourself too. Making sure that you're looking after yourself, making sure you have your own coping skills in place, that you're aware of things like your own window of tolerance, what you can cope with at that time. Um, because although it sounds cheesy, it really is true. You can't support other people if you're not supporting yourself. That's where we need to start. Next slide, please, Caroline. So to do so, if we're thinking about things like open communication and we want to build resilience, and if we have to have those difficult conversations, which it can be really difficult, particularly if you're going through menopause, or particularly if someone in your household is, and you've got someone going through puberty, it can be really difficult to speak about these things and admit, actually, this is really tough for me. So doing that, some of the things we can think about or remind ourselves is things like this, that the brain is a learning organism. So we know through trauma research that the brain is constantly learning. We have this lovely thing called neuroplasticity, that even if we have been affected by ACEs and stress, which then affects the development of that prefrontal cortex, or if we're going through puberty and again we're still not using that prefrontal cortex, that is, it will change, it can be changed. And the way we do that is through trusting relationships. So compassionate relationships built on kind of empathy and open communication. Reminding yourself that the brain can account for some of that behavior we find challenging. So when it feels even really personal, just that reminder of, actually, this isn't a personal attack on me. This is something happening in the brain that they can't control right now and I can't control. So reminding ourselves that there's some sort of communication behind that challenging behavior and I just need to help and support in the best way I can. This one in particular, I always thought I used quite a lot when I was teaching. It really helped me kind of take a breath and reframe and think about, actually, what I do next has the biggest impact. So by responding differently, we can create a different outcome. So giving myself, 5, 10 seconds even to go, what I say next, or what facial expression I show next, or what reaction I have is going to have the biggest impact on the next kind of reaction from these young people. And it really gave me that kind of thinking space to go, okay, if I lose it and I turn around and I scream, what is there going to be any benefit in that? No. So do I need to take a minute? Do I need to take a breather? And actually, the next words that come out of my mouth is going to choose which kind of path and direction this conversation goes in. If you do have to have a difficult conversation, try and make space for it and make time for it. If it's particularly uncomfortable, you might think about things like sideways communication, so going for a walk and having a conversation, driving the car next to each other. Don't be afraid to kind of take a pause or break. If you can feel like it's getting too heated or it's just becoming too difficult, it's okay to say, this is too much right now. Let's come back to this later. And we want to use things like active listening. So any of the skills, like asking open questions, kind of verbal and non-verbal signs of encouragement, nodding, again, asking open questions, and then repeating and reflecting back what that person has said to you. Just to show them that you've really listened and gives them a chance to go, yes, you've understood, or no, that's not what I meant. And the very last one, using non-blaming language. So this is where we can use things like I statements or we statements. And what we mean by that is just essentially we're avoiding using the word you, which can end up being feeling quite threatening or quite blaming, you never do this or you always do that. Actually, just having that slight shift in language and saying, I feel, really hurt when I'm not listened to, or I feel disrespected when the house is left a mess. And all that's doing is shifting from, I'm not saying you've done anything, I'm saying, actually, this is really difficult for me. So what are we going to do together to change this? And this is something that's used in mediation a lot. And again, can be really useful to model kind of the start of a difficult conversation. So we have fired through lots of different points. I noticed there might have been some questions. So like Amy said, if we might be able to have some time at the end to come back to. But Caroline, I think other than that, we can go to the next slide and I can pass back to Amy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. Incredibly fascinating. And those 6 ways in which hormones affect teenagers in terms of their emotions and behavior is really, I find it so important in terms of, building that understanding of that this is not about their personality, this is about their development in the phase that they're going through, and some really helpful tips and suggestions about how families can navigate that together. Yeah, as you said, I'll not take questions now. We'll come back and we'll deal with questions for both yourself and Lindsay together. But please do put them in the chat if there are questions coming to you, and what we can come back to them. But I will move on to our next speaker, who is Lindsay Harrison. And Lindsay grew up on the Black Isle in the Highlands before moving to Edinburgh to study nursing in 1990. And she qualified as a registered general nurse in 1993 and found her niche as a nurse practitioner in general practice in 2004. And this role sparked her interest in female health, and she gained her family planning theory and practice qualification in 2006. And in 2021, she undertook training with the British Menopause Society and completed their Principles and Practice of Menopause Care course. And having set up and run one of the first dedicated menopause clinics in general practice in Edinburgh in 2022, she decided to take her passion and knowledge for all things menopause into workplaces and set up Workplace Menopause Support. And Lindsay's going to talk to us about the perimenopause period and the role hormones play in some of its symptoms and effects. So, Lindsay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to everyone who's joining us. I saw when everyone was saying where they were coming from, there was people from Tane, Nairn and Inverness, and as Amy said, I'm from the Black Isle, so we're probably related, but it's nice to have people from the Highlands and all over Scotland joining us. What Amy didn't allude to, I'm going to share with you, is where this journey all started for me was back in early 2020. I was down here in Edinburgh, sister in the Black Isle, couldn't travel up during the pandemic, and I was speaking to my sister a lot more on the phone. And I was whinging about various ailments that I had, and my sister said to me, Lindsay, do you think that might be perimenopause symptoms? And I was really embarrassed when she said that. Now, I wasn't embarrassed about the fact that I was becoming perimenopausal. I was an age that would be happening to me, but I was really embarrassed that as a nurse, I didn't recognise those symptoms for myself. And my sister, who's non-medical but older than me, she was the one that picked it up. And that's why we have to remember it can be really difficult to know when we're in this phase of life. And if I didn't recognise it as a nurse, I understand how challenging it can be for all of you as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that this evening. So next slide, thanks, Caroline. So I'm going to talk about perimenopause. That also links into menopause, the onset and the symptoms you might be experiencing. So perimenopause is a phase of life that comes before menopause. And we define menopause as the point where a woman has not had a period for 12 consecutive months. So you've had no period for 12 months, you're classed as being menopausal. Now, this bit of time, perimenopause, it comes immediately before menopause, but it's a really confusing phase of life for a lot of women. Their periods might be becoming irregular. They might be starting to get some symptoms they've never had before, but they might not realise that they're actually in perimenopause. I often say to women in clinic, it'd be so much easier if a little light came on at the side of our bed one morning and said, you're now in perimenopause. Everything would be clear to us if that happened. But we don't have that functionality. And it's working out how we can get help to get through this phase of life and recognise what's going on. Next slide, thanks, Caroline. So I always apologise for this slide because I know it looks like something you might have seen in a biology class at school, and no one wants to be taken back there, especially on a Thursday evening being dragged back into your biology classes. But it's important to understand what is going on with our hormones, what causes these changes. And if you look at the little red line on this, that is your estrogen through a female lifespan. And you can see in the reproductive years, it's in this nice little tight cycle that is going through every month. And then next click, thanks, Caroline. And then look what happens in perimenopause. Now, I explain this to women in clinic. It's like your estrogen has jumped on a roller coaster. It's high, it's low, it's high, it's low. And this peaking and troughing estrogen, that's what can trigger your symptoms to start becoming irregular. And that might also be what triggers the start of this wide range of symptoms that we can experience. Next click, thanks, Caroline. Now, we're also thinking about adolescents tonight, and I think it's always really interesting to look what's going on with their hormones. And Katie has already kind of alluded to this in her talk. It's no surprise, it's the same thing that's going on. So those fluctuating hormones, it's causing, you know, a little bit of the angst that they're going through, a little bit of the things that Katie was talking about, what happens with adolescents. They've got exactly the same things going on with their hormones as we have with our hormones at the other end of the journey. And then you'll see in menopause, what tends to happen is estrogen goes down very low and remains at that low level. Next slide, thanks. And one click, thank you. So we want to think about the average onset and the duration of these symptoms. So this will vary widely from woman to woman. There is no kind of defined age, but the majority of women will start to have symptoms in their mid to late 40s for perimenopause. And we know that the kind of average age of perimenopause is somewhere around 47 years, but it's an average. We have to remember that lots of women will go into this phase of life earlier and a lot of women will go into it later. For women, when they become menopausal, the average age tends to be around 51. But the duration of symptoms will differ for everyone, and each woman's journey is very much unique to her. It is very, very different for everyone. Next slide, thanks, Caroline. So we need to think about symptoms. These fluctuating hormones that we were talking about, it's going to kind of be the thing that initiates symptoms. And I've split the symptoms into physical symptoms and psychological symptoms. And we're going to look at the physical symptoms. And as you would have seen as they're coming on the slide, there's so many, it's a wide spectrum. And I always ask people to kind of type in the chat box if there's any symptoms that have come up there that you're really surprised to see, that you didn't actually think these symptoms would be something that you might experience in perimenopause and menopause. I'll wait to see if anyone types anything in the chat box to see if there's any surprises. So yeah, absolutely tinnitus. When tinnitus comes along, you might not realise that that's to do with perimenopause. Lots of people, again, there's obviously lots of women out there with tinnitus. The dental and gum issues as well. And you can imagine what happens in this phase of life. A woman is still having periods. She's not thinking about perimenopause, and she might suddenly start to get tinnitus. She goes off to GP surgery. They'll investigate it. She'll probably go to audiology, get a hearing test, and all those tests come back normal. And then it could be the next month she starts getting horrible migraines. She's never had headaches like this before. Back she goes to GP surgery. They investigate it. She might get a brain scan, maybe some blood tests, and then everything comes back normal, which is very reassuring, but she still doesn't have an answer as to why she's getting these symptoms. And the same could be said for joint pain and palpitations. Lots of investigations going on as to why these symptoms are happening, but when all the tests come back normal, which is very reassuring, it also isn't giving you the answer as to what's causing your symptoms. And that's why women don't often know what's going on when they experience these things and they look at them individually and they get them investigated individually. It can be very confusing why you're having these things going on. But I always talk about joining up the dots. If you start to join up the dots and look at these as a collective symptoms, you might start to work out, I wonder if this might be perimenopause that I'm experiencing. Next slide, thanks. Now, if those physical symptoms were not bad enough, we then have the psychological symptoms to contend with. And you will see as they come onto the screen here, there are a lot of those and a wide variety of those as well. And what can be particularly difficult through this phase of life is if you're a woman who's already had a pre-existing condition, it might be anxiety, it could be low mood, maybe you've had altered sleep. And then, lo and behold, these things start getting worse and they are escalated and your anxiety seems much worse than it has been before, or suddenly your low mood seems worse than before. You can have two things running alongside each other. You can have your pre-existing condition and then you can have that emphasised, made worse when perimenopause comes. Now, I always say to all audiences when they have seen these two slides come up, if there are women in the audience who have not yet reached this phase of life, please don't be sitting there worrying that when you become perimenopausal, you're going to experience all of these symptoms. That would be very unusual. You know, if we were sitting there thinking that was going to be happening, we'd be thinking this is going to be an awful phase of life. I'm not going to look forward to that. But it's a spectrum of symptoms. Not everyone will get all of these symptoms that I've shown to you, and also the severity that we experience them will be very different from woman to woman. Around 75% of women will get symptoms. So you have to remember there are 25% of women who are really lucky and aren't going to get any of these symptoms at all. Now, they don't tend to talk about it and boast about it because none of their friends would speak to them if that happened. And they probably wouldn't get invited out to the pub and out for dinner if they were the ones saying, I've got no symptoms at all. So, it's important to remember this is a spectrum of symptoms. Next slide, thanks. So I talked about how it can be really difficult to know what's going on. You're still having periods, you have these odd symptoms going on, and how can you work out? So it's what I would always say is you need to be tracking what's going on. And there's a great app called the Balance app. Now, there's two Balance apps, there's Balance and there's Balance Plus. You just need the free one, Balance. You don't need to pay for the Balance Plus because everything you need to do is on that free one that you can get there. And that will let you track what's going on with your periods. So you'll start to see when your menstrual cycle is becoming a little bit irregular. It will also let you track your symptoms that you're experiencing. So it'll ask you to fill in you'll get prompted to fill out what symptoms you've been experiencing that day. And you can start to see if there's a pattern building up. And it will also let you generate a report of these things that you can print out and take that along to your doctor's appointment when you might go along to discuss your symptoms. And then you'll also get access to lots of really, really good evidence-based articles through that app as well. So I tend to say to women, in your 30s and definitely in your early 40s, get that app downloaded on your phone so you've got it there for when you know that you want to start using it. Next slide, thanks. So a lot of this overlaps with what Katie was saying. When I listened to Katie at House of Hormones in the festival, although I was very nervous about speaking next, the bits I listened and I could hear Katie talking about, I realised there are so many things that overlap with what Katie's advice on telling you what to do and what's happening with your adolescence and what we tend to advise in perimenopause and menopause as well. So we know that there is a bit of an impact in the family household. We know that perimenopause impacts in that home environment. And Katie was talking about how it's important to kind of regulate yourself emotionally when you're dealing with your children. But I also know when you get into perimenopause and menopause, emotional regulation becomes much harder when you have those fluctuating hormones. And most of us on the call who have gone through perimenopause and are in this menopause phase of life will probably recognise at least one occasion when we weren't able to use our emotional regulation. I certainly can remember time with my children, like Amy said, full disclosure, I've got two teenagers and I'm very much in this phase of life, but I can remember times when my children have done something, normally together, fooling around, playing, and something that they've done had triggered me to get really angry and start shouting at them. And I wouldn't normally have shouted at them for that thing. And I've become really angry. I've lost my temper. I've shouted at them and I've shouted at them, with such force that they have become really scared, gone off together to their bedroom, and then they're off feeling really worried about what's happened. And I'm left feeling really scared about what happened with my emotions, that kind of explosion of shouting at them. And then, as most of us will kind of be able to remember, that feeling of guilt, that feeling of I've been a terrible parent, I've shouted at my children when I shouldn't have shouted at them. And it is really, really hard and really emotional when we experience that. The other thing that happens with those symptoms that I was talking about is you will be getting increased fatigue, more tired, maybe not sleeping as well at night time, maybe that mood impacting on you as well. And that fatigue impacts our patience and the energy that we need to deal with in everyday parenting challenges. We all know that no 2 days are the same. Some days we get away with it quite lightly when we don't have parenting challenges. Other days it can feel like our kids are throwing everything at us. What's happened at school, what's happened with their friends, a test that didn't go particularly well. And if we haven't got the energy, if we're kind of feeling fatigued and we haven't got the energy that day to deal with that, it makes it really, really hard to try and help and support our children when they need us on days that we don't have the energy to deal with that. And all of that, kind of when we put it together, it makes it really difficult to resolve conflicts within the family. I mean, quite often, parents do this together. Mums and dads definitely do conflict resolution together. But as a mum, I know that quite often often I was trying to deal with conflicts between, the children together, the siblings, or if they'd fallen out with one parent or the other, and I was kind of the peacekeeper and trying to keep things kind of going and resolve things. And I lost my ability to do that because I didn't have the patience to do it. My brain fog clouded that I couldn't see things that clearly. And, quite often dads will ask, what is my role in all of this? And I think they really have to, step up and take over the conflict resolution within the family if the mum is struggling with her symptoms and perimenopause and finding that more difficult. And as Katie said, at the same time, we've got all of this going on. Our teenagers are going through the exactly same thing with their hormone journey, which makes this conflict resolution, doubly challenging when you've got two different members of the family struggling with their own kind of hormone challenges at the same time. Next slide. Thanks, Caroline. So again, a big overlap with what Katie said. How do we deal with this? How are we going to get through, this phase of life? How do we successfully navigate parenting during perimenopause and menopause? So I always say, same as Katie, the communication is absolutely key to survival. We need to have these open and transparent conversations to help our adolescents understand the complexities of what's going on in our family relationships and the dynamics. And we need to think about the age of our children, different levels of understanding. There were some great questions that's pre-submitted about, how do we explain this to children who might have autism or if they have, ADHD? How do we find the language to explain to the children what's going on? So we have to use age-appropriate language and terms that they are going to be able to understand. And each of us will know our own children best to work out how we explain it. And we need to encourage empathy and understanding within the family. Now, I'm going to share with you how I've done this with my own teenagers. When I started to see that I was struggling with my symptoms, I sat my children down individually when I thought they were at the age they could understand. And I explained to them that I could see that they were struggling with their hormones and that I knew that they were having these fluctuations that meant, that's why they didn't want to speak to me. That's why they maybe got a bit grumpy with me. And that's why they didn't want to get up in the morning, possibly didn't want to tidy their bedroom. And the idea of having a shower was absolutely awful when I suggested it. And they were nodding along and saying, yeah, that's exactly what's going on in my life. And I know that, it's good that you understand that that's why I'm being quite difficult at the moment. And then what I do is I then flip the conversation on its head and I say to them, I need you to understand that the exact same thing is going on with my hormones right now. My hormones are peaking and troughing, and I'm going through a phase of life that's called perimenopause. And that is what makes me get more angry and sometimes shout at you a little bit louder or more often than I did before. These hormones fluctuating is what is making me cry sometimes when you haven't seen me cry at things before. This is what's causing me to argue with your dad a little bit more, because I think for children it can be really worrying when we see us arguing more and not understanding what's going on with their parents. So when I've got them to understand that this is what's going on with my hormones as well, I explain to them that I'm giving them lots of, you know, extending their boundaries, trying to be more understanding for them. And I expect them to actually do the same thing for me and give me a little bit of understanding of what's going on and stop maybe giving me such a hard time when I'm maybe a little bit more angry or getting cross with them. Because if we can all show empathy to each other about what is going on with these hormones, I do think it makes family living a lot easier. And you'll find your own ways to have this conversation with your children and your family. And I think from me, the final thing I want to say is please remember, you are not alone navigating through this phase of life. There are millions of families around the world who are all navigating this as well. And if you are finding it difficult or you've suddenly realised you're going through this phase of life, talk to your friends, talk to your family, be the one to open up this conversation. Because I promise you, when you do that and you talk about the struggles that you're going through, suddenly your friends and family will be saying to you, actually, I'm in that same boat as you. I know how difficult it is. Or actually, we're coming out of it, but here's what I did that helped me when I was going through it. And you'll get lots of great tips and advice from your friends and family to help you navigate this. And good luck with it, because I know it is not easy. I'm in that boat with you as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Such a fount of knowledge and expertise, kind expertise. And I think that slide is just, it says it all. It might feel like a biology class, but it's so important to recognize that there's such similar things going on in terms of hormone fluctuations in puberty and perimenopause, and helping to share that understanding both ways. It's not always easy, but you know, it's so important. So thank you very much. We have, fortunately, some time for questions. We wanted to keep a good amount of time because we know that everybody that's here this evening has their own experiences and might have their own particular questions or issues that they want to raise and benefit from the expertise of Katie and Lindsay. So please do put the quick Q&As in the chat. We also had some received in advance, so I'll maybe just kick us off with a couple of ones that people sent in beforehand. Yeah, maybe Lindsay, you did allude to this earlier, but we had quite a few questions received about how you manage puberty and perimenopause when there's also neurodivergence in the family. And I don't know if either of you have anything to add to that in terms of families that are dealing with that extra complexity as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to add a little bit in terms of the puberty thing, puberty with neurodivergence. I think, as we mentioned, there's so many changes already, but then when we add neurodivergence, often with puberty, you think about things like sensory issues or emotional regulation. Potentially, they're going to be much more difficult to manage. Social norms might be a bit more confusing, so those attachments might become a bit more difficult. And we know it might have an impact on executive function. So with that in mind, I would say the kind of useful things you can do, I would always kind of track and monitor. So I know like Lindsay was saying, track and monitoring in terms of menopause symptoms, but actually you can kind of do the same with triggers and needs. So, you know, what kind of things am I finding are really triggering, you know, my sensory issues or emotional regulation, or what's having the biggest impact on my executive function. Because then if you can do that, you can start to think about, okay, well, what coping skills are going to be really useful for me? What kind of things can I put in place? What routines are going to help? And I think routines in general for anyone can be really useful, however they look. But having that kind of idea of routines around physical well-being, you know, how am I going to make sure I'm looking after my physical health and my mental health as well? Am I making sure I've got things like sensory breaks? Do I need visual schedules? And I think this works for both adults and young people. And to be honest, I would say neurodivergent or not, or neurotypical, all these things are just helpful when you've got all these fluctuations in your hormones. And as I think Lindsay and I are probably going to keep continuously saying, so I'm sorry, just communication, communicate those needs. So if you know sensory issues are already heightened, let people know that, you know, don't be ashamed to say, actually, I really struggle with um like lighting in a room, or I really struggle with this kind of issue, or I'm not very good at reading emotions, so you're going to have to let me know or be a bit clearer with your communication. I think that is absolutely okay. And again, as Lindsay has already said, have a support system, you know, have people that you can speak to, groups, whether that is friends and family or whether that is, you know, a support network elsewhere, like groups, youth groups or adult groups, but just people or organizations around you that you know you can turn to. So I think any of these things are useful for anyone, neurodivergent or not. But I think being extra mindful that puberty is going to potentially intensify some of those issues we see. So making sure you're really aware of them, if that helps.
And I would add in, Katie, there's so much that's similar. Katie and I realize this when we speak, we kind of mirror each other in what we say. And it's the same in perimenopause. We know for those that are neurodivergent that the symptoms you're experiencing are probably going to be heightened. And you're going to experience those maybe more. I talked about the spectrum of symptoms, but we know in neurodivergence, you're going to feel more heightened. And, you know, there are some research coming through on perimenopause and neurodiversity. So there is a bit more information out there. And I think when you go, you know, to speak to your healthcare professional, you know, just to open up and say to them, you know, I'm finding this all a bit difficult to navigate. And, the neurodivergent side of it is sometimes making it a bit more challenging. And this is what I'm finding difficult. And this is how you could maybe help me in the way that we communicate. This would make it easier for me. So just to have that, open up and say to your clinician, and just, you put it out there that this is how you want someone to communicate with you. But we know that it definitely can be heightened in neurodivergence.
Thank you both. Speaking of tracking, which I know you just mentioned, I know in the past, Lindsay, you've highlighted a NHS symptom checker for perimenopause, which I think were recommending before for people in terms of if they were wanting to go to their GP. Do you want to just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a great point to bring up, Amy, because there might be some things coming through in the chat about, the difficulty that some women find when they try and access HRT. Now, I run a menopause clinic in general practice. I sit in a little bubble, and I think we're doing brilliantly at looking after menopause women. And then I go into workplaces, and that bubble is very promptly burst when women tell me back the difficulties that they have when they go along and have this discussion with their GP. Now, I'm not GP bashing. I work with amazing GPs in the surgery that I work at. But the issue we have is a lot of GPs haven't had training in menopause and perimenopause. It's not that they don't want to help you, they just haven't had the training in what to look for. And I'm very fortunate that I've been able to have the training to run a menopause clinic. So what can be really helpful, there's resources that we're going to share with you after the call. And one of these resources is a menopause symptom sheet that you can access from NHS Inform. And you fill out this sheet before you go along to your appointment. You fill out your symptoms that you're experiencing, you grade them, you list how it's impacting you on your relationships in the home and in the workplace. And on the back of the sheet, you fill out what you want to talk about in that appointment. And I always say to women, put down 3 or 4 bullet points that are really important for you to discuss in that appointment. And then when you go to make the appointment, always ask, is there someone with a special interest in the menopause? You might have a menopause clinic at your doctor's surgery if you're lucky. If not, ask if there's someone with a special interest in women's health. It might be a nurse like me, might be your practice pharmacist that's taken that on board. So you want to make sure you're seeing the right place, the right person in the surgery. But I really would recommend using the NHS symptom sheet and taking that along to your appointment, because it really gives you a good foundation to build that appointment on. And I know that feedback from doctors women that have taken in that sheet is that they have found the sheet really, really helpful to guide them in their appointment.
Great. And yes, as Lindsay says, is we will be sharing a list of resources with everybody that signed up. So expect that to come into your email inbox over the next few days. And for the person or the people that have asked about the slides, we'll send the slides round as well. So you have that available to refer back to and follow up on afterwards. Just while we're on the subject of menopause in particular, there's been a few questions about how things like the mini pill or coils or other sorts of forms of hormone replacement, how they affect your experiences of menopause. Does that mean you don't go through perimenopause, or how do you deal with symptoms and all of that in those circumstances?
Those are amazing questions, and I'm so glad people have asked them to give me this chance to explain it all to you. So I said that, when your periods stop, you will be classed as being menopausal. Now, say you're on a form of contraception that is controlling your period. Say you have the Mirena coil, or you're taking the progesterone-only pill, and that has stopped your periods altogether. You're never going to know when is that date is that you become menopausal. And that's okay. It's absolutely fine not to know. We just have to get our heads around the fact that our periods have been stopped by our form of contraception, and that we'll never have a date that we need to know about, that this will be, that is when you go menopause. It's not a requirement that you need to know the date that you become menopausal. You've got to just get your head around that. Now, it's great when we don't have periods anymore. We love it if we have a coil and it stopped all our periods, or the pill stopped all our periods. That is fantastic. But it does make the perimenopause phase of life a little bit more challenging, because if you weren't on contraception and your periods started to become irregular, you would then have that as a little key, as a little sign that you're going into perimenopause. But if you're on a form of contraception that has stopped your periods all together, you're not going to have that guide. It makes it even harder. So for those women, you need to be even more alert at tracking your symptoms, really noticing what's going on with your body, taking a little journal of it, writing it down, using an electronic, form to control, to kind of follow it, because that is what's going to be your guide. Your periods are not going to guide you. And finally, if you're on the combined contraceptive pill, you can take the combined contraceptive pill up to the age of 50 as long as it remains safe for you. If you're on that, you are getting estrogen in that. That's a pill that's got estrogen and progesterone in it. So if you're on that pill, you will already be getting the estrogen that we would be giving you in your HRT. So you've got that estrogen. But what you need to be really, really mindful of is when you get to the age of 50 and we take away that pill from you and we switch you over to a progesterone pill or a coil, you might suddenly find yourself with some of those symptoms suddenly affecting you because we've taken away that estrogen. So if you switch from your combined contraceptive pill over to a progesterone pill or to Mirena coil or to nothing at all, but still use contraception up to the age of 56, that's really, really important. You might suddenly find you've got this symptoms that suddenly overwhelm you, that you're suddenly feeling them all at one time. And that's when you want to get along to your doctor and really clearly explain, when I stopped the pill, I started to experience all these symptoms.
Thanks very much. That's really helpful. Moving on to sort of teenagers and some of the questions relating to them. There's certainly one about teenagers finding it difficult to make friends, and I guess the going through puberty at the same time will not be helping with that. Katie, have you got any suggestions for any support that the parents can give to their children if they're feeling a bit lonely and isolated?
Yeah, sorry, I've just been trying to scan through the questions as well because I've seen a few kind of related to, I guess, kind of that empathy as well side of things. So I know somebody had asked about encouraging empathy when that empathetic part of the brain isn't developed, and I think that also links into that friendships as well. So in terms of, I guess, empathy, when we know that prefrontal cortex still developing, um, for me, one of the biggest things then is thinking about when to have those difficult conversations. So that's not to say that part of the brain isn't there. It will still be there and still working. It just isn't fully developed yet, meaning we're more likely to go to that lizard brain. So if you know you're about to have that difficult conversation, so like Lindsay was saying, if you're about to have a conversation around perimenopause and you want them to kind of understand, I think that's then considering, is this the best time? Can I tell that we're emotionally regulated? Have we used coping skills? Are we in the right space and kind of mindset to have difficult conversations? Because we want that empathy and that problem solving and that reasoning engaged. And the way we do that is making sure those kind of two parts are connected are through using things like coping skills. So if we're at that emotionally regulated kind of state, we're not feeling anxious, we're not feeling like we might move into fight or flight, then that part of the brain will actually be engaged. So when we're saying that, we're not saying that teenagers can't have empathy. Of course they can. It's just that if we feel that heightened emotion, or if we're expressing anger or we're feeling anxious, we are going to lose that connection, and that's where we lose that empathy. So to encourage it, I think really it's about having the conversations at the right time, so that we can then say, okay, you're regulated enough. I'm trying to encourage you to think about how I might feel at this point. I want you to think about how you feel, and that's really how we would do that. I think in terms of making friends, it is so difficult. We did an event kind of recently with young people involved, um, who were kind of 18 to 21, and they were just saying even how hard it is for them. They were neurodiverse young people, especially around having kind of spaces for them to go to. They're not going to want to hang out with their parents and carers. We know that kind of the attachment style and pushing away. I mean, if they do want to hang out with you, how lovely. But we know that generally they're not going to want to. So finding spaces that they can. And if that's not in school, school is not always the nicest place for young people, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean there's not other places. So finding hobbies, finding youth groups, encouraging that. I think it is a difficult time, but also reminding them that it is normal that we go through this, that, this might be the kind of rough patch. That doesn't mean we're never going to find, like our little group of people. It doesn't mean we're not going to find what we are good at, what we enjoy. that is exactly what these teenage years are for. And although that is incredibly difficult and always not nice to hear, I mean, you'll probably think back to as a teenager yourself where you think, I kind of remember not fitting in or liking these things that other people didn't like, and I didn't really know how to handle it. And then you grow up and you start to realize, well, that doesn't matter because I do enjoy those things and they are important to me. And now I've found a group of people who also do that. So I think as parents, all you can kind of do is encourage them to try new things, encourage them to, go out, find groups, find hobbies, and if it doesn't work out, remind them that although this is difficult, it is just a stage of life, and you will find those people and you will find those groups. So I'm sorry that's not more of a definitive answer to finding friends, but I think it can be difficult at lots of stages of life, and really that's all we can do.
Thanks, Katie. And yes, thanks for picking up the points about empathy as well. And that's, important to remember that it is making the conditions for empathy to emerge is a big part of the trick. There's a question about what advice, and I think this is probably for both of you, what advice would you give as an older father with 2 teenage girls and a mother who will possibly become perimenopausal in the next few years? What can he do? What part does he have to play?
Emigrate. Get your ticket now. No, I jest.
That's not what you're supposed to say.
Do not do that. So I think what you've done tonight by coming on this call is amazing. I saw that someone had put in the chat, are there men on the call? And yes, I hope that there are lots of men on the call, because it's really important that men learn what's going on. And I have a husband that has had to live with a perimenopausal woman and 2 adolescent children. He's out of earshot. He won't hear me saying this. I feel really sorry for him. I've never told him that, but it is a really, really challenging time. And I'm so glad you've come on the call. And I would say learn as much as you can. If you can learn, if you can find the Davina McCall documentary to watch online, if you can find podcasts to listen to, there's loads out there on the subject. Menopause Matters is a great website. They've got the Man Shed, and that is for men to kind of collectively come in and ask questions about things that they have maybe noticed their partners struggling with. So learn as much as you can. And then what I would say, and I kind of alluded to it in my slides, you really need to be the peacekeeper within the family. And I know that when I find things difficult in the house, it's when I feel my husband is taking a side with one of my teenage children. It's normally my daughter. And I sometimes feel if there's something that's happened that we're arguing about, that he will take her side. And I just feel that they're ganging up on me a little bit. And that's my emotions that's kicking in there. That's my hormonal emotions that's making me feel like that. It's not at all rational to feel that way. So what I've said to my husband is you really have to remain neutral. You are the peacekeeper as we're moving through this house of hormones phase of life. And as much as you maybe see one side of the argument or the other, it really, really is your job just to try and keep the peace and find a way for both of the sides, the mum and the children, to try and understand what is going on with each other. And talk to your friends as well. It can be really difficult, especially, if your partner, and I think this is a really important point to say, when we're talking about partners, we're not just meaning husbands. If there are women in a same-sex relationship and one woman has got this 25% severe symptoms and the other woman has got no symptoms at all, that is equally challenging for you in that relationship as well, when one's having symptoms and one isn't. So it's just trying to be the peacekeeper, try to get everyone to understand what's going on, and make sure you're looking after yourself as well. So talking to your friends, wherever you meet up with your mates, having a chat about it and seeing what's going on in their households as well, because you won't be alone. There'll be lots of people. And if you start to learn more and have conversations with your partner, and rather than saying, oh, I watched Davina and apparently you might be feeling like this, she might not be that responsive to that, because when we're going through this phase of life, we feel a bit old. There's these outdated connotations that being menopausal means you're old. You're not old at all. I am in my early 50s, but I am menopausal. I do not feel old. You might also feel slightly more unattractive to your partner, and you might not want to open up and talk to them. So what I say to men is, talk about it in kind of what your experience is. I listened to the Davina documentary, and I was really interested when I learned about these symptoms, or I read this in the newspaper today. I didn't know that. I found it really interesting. So if you're talking talking about what you're learning, your partner might be more open to talking to you. And finally, I'd say, a lot more when I go into workplaces and do education, we invite everyone to come. If you're a man and your workplace runs a menopause education slot, please go along and learn what's been talked about, because not only will your colleagues be grateful that you did that, but your partners will as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And just before I come to Katie for thoughts on that as well, we've had a couple of important comments in the chat about that not everybody has a partner at home either, and that there's lots of people dealing with this as single parents. And I guess the point is about finding your own support network in other ways. But the support network is absolutely vital. I don't know if there's anything you just wanted to say about that as well.
I mean, I can speak at least for the kind of teenage part. I think the fact that you're here listening to this, or as a dad, as a male, asking these questions, I think that in itself shows quite a lot. You're interested to learn, you want to learn, and you're asking for that support. So that's probably the first big, I think, step and things you can do. And I think in terms of teenagers in general, I think, being that place of emotional safety, that person that you can say, I'm listening to you, I want to share this, having those open conversations as we spoke about. And even if it's something you don't agree with, I think it's more important that you're saying, I'm here and I'm listening. I might not agree with what's been done or chosen, but I'm accepting the emotion, I'm accepting that this has happened. Because then you kind of can also say, well, if something does go wrong, I still want to be the person that's there for you. I guess being that consistent presence, so the person that is there again. So again, being emotionally available, but also physically there. I'm here to support you. But that being said, we also want to make sure there's things like healthy boundaries in place. Having boundaries is so important. So I think not only for yourself and your partner, but it means your teenage children know where your boundaries are, but also you know where their boundaries are. And again, that comes with open conversation, communication of, here's how much I can deal with, or here's what I can mentally cope with. Where's your line, or what can I support with? And if you've got those boundaries in place for both of you, it's much easier to say, do you know what? Today that crossed a bit of a boundary and I'm really struggling with that. So we need to kind of have that as a reminder. Um, and essentially, again, supporting them through this period where they're becoming individuals, they're trying to work out what they like, their friendship groups, their dislikes. So just having that kind of respect for them being, becoming adults, becoming these autonomous humans who have all these emotions and feelings. So finding ways to kind of support them in doing that. Again, even if you're thinking, oh God, not that, please not that choice, letting them try that, supporting them, and then being there if it doesn't work out as well.
I think what I would just add on to what Kate said, I'm conscious of time ticking down, but for parents who are on their own, probably even more important to have that conversation with your child, what's going on with your hormones, what's going on with my hormones. I'm going to be supporting you, but I need you to give me a bit of support as well. Now that we're talking about menopause a lot more, there are lots of fantastic menopause support groups all over the country, menopause cafes as well. I know in Edinburgh, we've got a team who are logging on as a group, the Spartans Community Foundation in the north of Edinburgh. They're a group of women that meet up regularly, and I think they've joined us as their group tonight on the call. So, have a look and see if you can find a support network where you're living, a menopause support group, so you can go along. I don't want you feeling on your own. You shouldn't be going through this on your own. You need to find other people that can support you. Peer support is great. Friendship support is great. So don't go through it alone. Reach out, talk about what you're experiencing, and find other networks to plug into to get you some support.